The gruesome news continues to come out of Ukraine as we watch the Russians attempt to advance with great brutality, killing children, bombing schools. All of these things continue. I guess if there's a bright spot, it is that Ukraine is going to prosecute its first war crimes case against a Russian soldier. This is a man who shot a civilian at point blank range twice in the head. So I think that will be a response that the West will be able to react to. Sweden and Finland have also indicated their desire to join NATO, and that would put NATO along about 1,400 kilometers of the Russian border. So it's a message. To talk about these things and many more, Marcus Kolga, an expert on Russian and Central Eastern European issues. He is also a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and the founder of something called Disinfo Watch. And this is key because the whole issue of disinformation and information is a new kind of warfare. So Marcus, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Where do you assess things? I mean, we have some Pollyanna versions and some Cassandra versions of what's going on. What's your assessment of where the Russians are today as they continue their move into Ukraine?
Well, look, from the Russian perspective, things are not going very well at all. At the beginning of this war, some nearly 3 months ago now, there were predictions on Russian state media from the Kremlin itself that Russian forces would be in Kiev within 2 to 3 days of the opening salvo, and like I said, we're moving into past month number 3 very shortly. The attack on Kiev that opened this war has been repelled successfully by Ukrainian forces. We're seeing Western governments reopening their embassies. Just recently, Justin Trudeau, Chrystia Freeland, and Melanie Joly, of course, traveled to Kiev to open that embassy again, raising the flag. Around Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, there are reports now that the Ukrainian forces are successfully pushing Russian forces back towards the border, perhaps even beyond the border. There are also reports that Russian forces are repositioning themselves into a defensive posture as they're concerned about successful Ukrainian counterattacks. But the human toll continues.
The Russians are becoming more brutal, it seems.
Well, this is
possible.
I think Vladimir Putin has become quite frustrated. He recognizes the fact that he's not doing well. He's losing. He's failing. His troops are failing him, and he's the war itself has become more of a war of terror against the Ukrainian people. The scale of brutality is unlike anything that we've seen in nearly the past 100 years, at least in Europe. The targeting of civilian infrastructure. There are hundreds of hospitals that have been targeted, schools, kindergartens, and the fact that refugees, as soon as Russia agrees to a green corridor that would allow those refugees in cities like Mariupol to flee to the west in safety, they shut them off. They even target these refugees. They bomb them. They bombed the railroad station in the north of Ukraine just 2 weeks ago. That was packed full of refugees. And when I say refugees, I mean women and children and the elderly, because the men are all fighting for to defend Ukraine. And so this train station was full of these men, women, and children and elderly, and it was specifically bombed to terrorize them and to kill these civilians.
Let me get to a question I was going to get to later, but I want to do it now. What is our red line? It is wonderful that we are reopening our embassy and that the Americans have sent another $40 billion worth of aid and support, and we are going to take more Ukrainians in if we could ever get through the damn paperwork. It's so stupid. That's the only word I can use. But what is going to be our red line? When are we going to say, okay, enough here? You can't go any further.
Well, I think that's the $1 million question. I think that the West has done a pretty good job arming Ukraine.
Mhm.
A lot of the success we're seeing today is because of the weapons that
Yep.
we've collectively provided them, not just Canada. And Canada is really a bit of a Johnny-come-lately
Yeah.
to the game when it comes to the really sort of powerful weapons, artillery and such. So, I think we've done a pretty good job there. The Ukrainians themselves have obviously done most of that heavy lifting with this, profoundly charismatic president, Zelensky.
Yeah.
He's really, provided that galvanizing force for the Ukrainian people that has really motivated them and given them the hope to defend themselves.
Yeah.
But when it comes to a red line, I see a few of them. Before we started talking on this podcast, we mentioned Odessa.
Yeah.
Odessa is a critical port, not just for Ukraine, but for the world.
Yes.
A large percentage of the world's grain moves through this port. And there's really serious concern around the world, within the UN itself, that Russia may target the infrastructure, the maritime infrastructure, the ports that are used to transport this grain. And if they do that, this could cause a massive worldwide food shortage. It could cause some significant starvation in places like Africa, Asia, and other places. I think this is something that the Western world, and certainly Canada, needs to be looking at. And we saw just this week, Vladimir Putin targeted Odessa. I mean, civilian infrastructure, which 2 hotels and a shopping mall with his hypersonic missiles. So I think this is just a few steps away from targeting the port. I think that Russia will, one of Putin's objectives is to take that port intact for himself, obviously. But barring that, and given the frustration that he's demonstrated in other places by targeting civilian infrastructure, it wouldn't surprise me at all if he targeted that maritime infrastructure in the coming days or weeks of this war. That ought to be a red line for Canada and the rest of the world.
So it's not just, this is the point. It's not just nuclear war or chemical warfare. Like, there's got to be something before that. The food security issue is huge. We've already got supply chain issues around the world, and that would be a fundamental one.
That would be a fundamental one. But honestly, if you ask me, I thought the red line I thought we crossed that, or Vladimir Putin crossed that already weeks ago. When he targeted Mariupol. He's obliterated the city, and he is targeting civilians. The fact that we of course all saw the horrors that happened in the suburb of Kiev of Bucha. These men with their hands tied behind their backs with single gunshot wounds to the back of their heads, just lying on the street. The reports of systematic rape. To me, these are all red lines. I think that one place where Vladimir Putin has been successful is intimidating us to not act, to not provide those no-fly zones, to not protect the refugees through his nuclear saber rattling. And I think that there has to come a point where we call him on that.
And we have been slow all along, whether it was Georgia or Crimea or shooting down MH17. Perhaps, I know this is spilled milk, but, if our response had been a little stronger in those cases, if we put more weaponry on the ground, maybe he wouldn't have been in there. I know there's...
But you're absolutely right. We've seen this pattern emerge starting in 2007, to be quite honest, when he tried to destabilize Estonia and provoke a conflict there. We've seen that he has this voracious appetite for conflict. And we've had all of these opportunities to stand up and say, no, stop, you're not doing this anymore. And every time we've failed. We've either failed to impose any sort of costs to his behavior, and we've allowed him to go along with it. After 2014, the first invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces and the annexation of Crimea, we placed some sanctions on Russia, but within weeks we were back to business as usual. And this is the calculus that Vladimir Putin is dealing with. That we will do nothing.
Gets the Olympics and the sporting events and goes to G20 meeting. Yeah, it's just, to me, it's nuts. Now, you and Bill Browder, the man famous for getting many countries to look at the Magnitsky his lawyer, a man who was killed by Vladimir Putin. I guess that's the only way to put it.
Yes.
You wrote a piece, and Bill's actually going to be a guest with us here in a couple of weeks too on the podcast.
Great.
But you wrote a recent piece on the importance of sanctions and that we have to keep it up. Sometimes it seems too little, too late. But is it working in any way that you can see?
Well, it is working. The sanctions that we've now finally imposed on the Putin regime, and we should have been imposing these sort of sanctions on him already in 2014. Right. And I think that had we done it then, it would have changed his view and his calculus on Ukraine today. And I don't think that we would have seen the bloodshed that we're seeing today. But, we're doing it now. These sanctions are having an effect on various different levels. First of all, on Putin's ability to make war. We know that the production lines for Russian tanks have stopped, and they've stopped already for several weeks because Vladimir Putin has no access to the Western parts that he needs, the technology to make them work and to put them together. The shipyards in Russia have stopped working. He's no longer able to build new naval ships because they don't have the ability to finance those operations. So that stopped. Just today, the Washington Post is reporting that the Putin regime has now resorted to basically stripping household appliances for parts, and they are literally using those to try and patch up the weapons that have been damaged in the war. That's how bad things have become for Putin with those sanctions in the context of the war. So in that sense, they are absolutely working. They're also working insofar as they're crippling Russia's economy. Now, we need to wait a little bit longer for those sanctions to work and to really take effect before the Russian people, certainly in Moscow and St. Petersburg, feel their bite and start to, hopefully rise up and start questioning the Putin regime and its leadership. And there are also cracks appearing amongst the oligarchs who hold Vladimir Putin's money, who enable him, and certainly the corrupt officials who support and enable the regime. I think there's a lot of questioning going on. We're seeing that a lot of generals, members of the FSB, this is the successor organization to the KGB, high-ranking officials, generals have been arrested. They've been placed under house arrest. So I think the cracks are appearing. And what's most important for the Western world right now is to continue applying this pressure to make sure that we do not lift those sanctions. We start enforcing them and applying more of them so long as Vladimir Putin is in power. That is the only way that we're going to see change. We cannot allow ourselves to let up, and we should certainly not allow ourselves to go back to business as usual with Russia.
Yeah, and we just got to stop buying his oil and gas because that's what funds it. And if we could help Europe, we'd have a little bit more credibility in asking them to take the hit. That's right.
We're funding, at least Europe right now is funding Vladimir Putin's war machine to the tune of $1 billion a day. That's how much oil is right now and gas is being bought. And that's right. We need to cut that off. Canada also needs to cut off. We're still buying refined oil from Russia. We need to stop doing that. And you're absolutely right. We have a resource right here in Canada, our natural gas, that can help stabilize the situation in Europe, to wean Europe off of Russian gas. And we can offer a safe and stable alternative to that, even if we start exporting our gas to the United States, which would allow them to start exporting more to Europe until we build those plants.
They're building the LNG terminals, and we can't get ours done at this late date fast enough.
Well, we can't get our proverbial stuff together to get that done. This is something that we need to do immediately. This has to be a national priority, both in the context of national security, the security of our allies, but also in our economic interests. I've spoken to senior officials in the Baltics. They all say that they are waiting for Canadian gas. They have offshore LNG terminals that could be filled with Canadian gas, and that's what they want. And we can also help on the nuclear front as well in building new reactors. But Canada has a big role to play here.
No, and I think that you're right, that this could be harnessed. I mean, when you look at the support there is in communities across the country, I mean, we're apparently not sending any displaced Ukrainians much further west than Winnipeg, although I literally know people who have opened their homes and their basements and their kids' spare rooms and all of that, but we have to find a way to get them there. There is acceptance and support for this. We could kind of turn it into a national project. Let's get this oil and gas moving so that we can stop this guy once and for all. Okay, I want to come back to or stay on the sanctions for a bit, because we've talked about the oligarchs. Some of them are mysteriously committing suicide. Another one of those phrases, but the one I thought might work is that Putin's mistress and the mother of some of his children, who's been holed up in Switzerland, has actually been moved out, supposedly. I don't know to where. Do you know any details on that? That strikes me that this is the kind of thing that might get to him.
Yeah, I don't know the details about that, but that's one way of certainly getting to Putin. It's a smart way of engaging in psychological warfare. One of Vladimir Putin's greatest weaknesses is his ego. When he looks in the mirror, he sees himself standing beside Joseph Stalin and Ivan the Terrible.
Yeah.
He needs to feel and portray this image, or project rather this image that he's this heroic defender of Russian interests, that he can defend the Russian people and his own family. When he can, when the West places these sanctions on his oligarchs and on Russia, and that demonstrates his weakness and his inability to do so. The fact that his mistress is being targeted, that also demonstrates a very profound weakness in that he can't even protect his own family from these sanctions. So, I think it's a really effective way of quote unquote sort of messing with Vladimir Putin.
No, exactly, because even the fact that we're talking about him, we'll be talking about that issue, will be making him angry.
That's right. It's that weakness, and he cannot tolerate anyone that exposes his weaknesses, because he so relies on that image of being the strong man. So this is a really effective way of chipping away at his ego and that image of a strong man.
Yeah. The moves this week by Finland and Sweden to say, yes, we're ready, we're going to take votes, and we would love to join NATO, please take us in, and then NATO will have to have a bunch of meetings and votes. Is there some way we could do that in the next 15 minutes or say 6 months, so that it doesn't go on?
Well, I think that NATO is going to do everything it can to expedite this process. Look, I think that Finland and Sweden fall into all the criteria. They've checked off all the boxes already. Right. Sweden may have to increase its defense spending. I think Finland is above the 2% spending requirement, because
Sweden still has a pretty good military, even though the spending. No, not really.
I think that I've been looking at the Nordic region very closely for the past 15 years or so, and I have very good friends in Sweden who've for years complained that I think the Swedes fell into this trap harder than anyone after the Cold War, believing that it was the end of history, and because they believed it so much so that they really allowed their defensive capabilities to erode. They took their focus off of that, and it was only a few years ago. That
might be like another country we both know and love.
Which one is that? And so they're only coming to that they have been coming to the realization that they need to bolster their defense spending and their capabilities over the past 4 or 5 years or so. But I think that most of us who have watched Finland and Sweden, my parents are Estonian, so this is very close to my heart. I keep a very close eye on Baltic Sea security. The fact that none of us would have thought 2.5 months ago that Finland or Sweden would ever consider joining NATO. It wasn't on the table. Yeah. And the fact that Vladimir Putin, who's one of his primary objectives is the the pulling apart and the erosion of the cohesion within NATO and in the West, the fact that he's actually managed to screw things up so badly that he's bringing the West together in such a way that, in a way that we wouldn't have ever dreamed of 2.5 months ago. Now Sweden and Finland coming into NATO, none of us would have thought of it. Finland is well known.
My mother used to say, cutting off your nose to spite your face.
You got it. And and a country like Finland, I mean, they put a heck of a lot more effort over the past decade into appeasing Vladimir Putin than to pushing back against him. The fact that they're the first out of the gate now today, Finland's president Niinistö and Prime Minister Sunin, they've basically run into NATO's arms, and hopefully, like we were talking about earlier, that hopefully NATO can expedite that process and get them in there. And I think Canada, quite frankly, will benefit from this as well. These are Nordic nations, Arctic nations. Finland has a heck of a lot of experience in Arctic defense, and so hopefully we can learn from them. And because we've really failed to develop our own Arctic defenses, maybe now we can rely on the Finns to help defend our Arctic.
Yeah, we're very, very exposed, in the north for sure, and we keep promising to do something, and then magically we don't. But is it important? And I come back to this issue with Finland. I mean, they are on the border. I think it's 1,300 or 1,400 kilometers or miles. I'm not sure which, but probably kilometers. That's a big that's a big stretch. I don't know where it is exactly, but it sends the message to him that we're on your border.
Well, that's right. I mean, the Finnish border pretty much runs from St. Petersburg all the way north to the Arctic Sea. So it's long, it's exposed. Vladimir Putin said today through his spokesman that Finland would pay the price for joining NATO. I'm not sure what that means. Right. I think that one of the silver lining in this war, in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is that it really exposed the weakness of Russia's army. This is a country that tried to project itself as a superpower. The quality of its weapons, the low morale of its troops, the inability of its generals to engage in any sort of meaningful strategy. They're relying on World War II type of strategies. It's really exposed the weakness of this army. It's more like a middle power army. And so he may threaten Finland and Sweden with potential future conflict. I'm not sure if I were a Finn, I'm not sure how concerned I'd be. We've seen how his army performs, and we know the Finnish army is highly, very well trained. It's large because it relies on the entire society being part of that defense, and it's well equipped. So I'm not sure how concerned I'd be, and if we're if you have NATO joining in or Finland joining NATO, I think that's I don't think there's much chance of any sort of conflict. Look, Vladimir Putin, he wants to survive. He's not suicidal. So I doubt that he would engage in any sort of serious conflict against NATO anytime soon, unless he's really cornered and he's completely delusional. But I think Finland is safe for now.
So it gets to the question, I guess, of regime change. I don't believe he's suicidal either. I think I know exactly that he knows exactly what he wants to do here. So we heard President Biden talk about that, maybe not deliberately, but he did say that. We've heard some Republicans now talk about the end game has to be regime change. We see the rhetoric from the West, including our own country, responding, calling this genocide, which of course it most certainly is. How might that happen? How could that happen? It would have to come from the inside, would it not?
It would have to come from the inside. This is not something that we can do, but it's something that needs to happen. I would completely agree with President Biden and every other Western leader who has said that. This is only going to end. The violence, the cycle of conflict, and certainly the violence in Ukraine, the only way this is going to end is with the end of Vladimir Putin and his kind, his kleptocrats. Because we know that Vladimir Putin has every intention of remaining in power as long as possible. Just last summer, in fact, he changed the constitution of his country. That would allow him to remain in power until at least 2035. And you can bet that if he gets to 2035, he's going to stay in power for another 10 years, if at all possible. So if that's the case, and unless something changes, we're in this for the long haul. This is the new normal, this cycle of conflict from Russia. He will rebuild up his armies, and then he will attack somewhere else. He is good at causing problems everywhere and creating enemies. That's what he needs to remain in power, to tell his own people that only, like as we were saying earlier, that only he can protect them. And so regime change is required. How does that happen? It's a good question. I think that the sanctions, we need to keep on, we need to sustain them, and we need to keep growing them, and we need to enforce them. We need to do everything we can to keep those going. I think that they're a long-term prescription, as Bill Browder and I wrote in Canada's media last week, that sanctions are like medicine. You need to keep taking them in order to arrive at the cure. And that's what we need to keep doing now. We need to keep the same level of sanctions we have now, or increase them. That will take those cracks that are appearing in the oligarchs and the security apparatus that keeps Vladimir Putin in power. It takes those cracks and it will continue expanding them. The ultimate goal would be to have the Russian people rise up and demand a change in leadership.
So sanctions have to bite them, so that, that's always the problem with sanctions. You're punishing the population in general, and he's protected. He's not running short of bread.
Well, hold on. I'm not sure that those sanctions are necessarily going to affect the broader Russian populace, the ones that live outside of St. Petersburg and Moscow. Vladimir Putin has done this himself. He has done his people no favors over the past 20 years. In fact, the Russian Auditor General, in his 2019 report, warned that 1 in 3 hospitals in Russia do not have running water. 40% of those hospitals don't have central heating. This is, indicative of the failure of the Putin regime, the crumbling infrastructure that's endemic all across Russia. Vladimir Putin is causing more problems himself than sanctions ever could. And so the hope is that those sanctions, the hope is that they would bite the elite in St. Petersburg and Moscow. But that would also be combined with Vladimir Putin's own failures, domestic failures, to create that sort of grassroots uprising that needs to happen. But right now, I think he's done a very good job of repressing his people. He's silenced them. People like Alexei Navalny, who was a natural leader, is in prison. Boris Nemtsov before him, of course, who was a very popular Russian pro-democracy opposition leader. He was such a threat that Vladimir Putin had him assassinated in 2015. And then, of course, there was Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is a very effective opponent and critic of Vladimir Putin as well. He was arrested just 2.5 weeks ago and charged with these absurd new laws that outlaw any mention of the word war in the context of the Russian invasion. And
but this is the problem when you're counting on a domestic uprising, is they know the price is their head.
That's right. And Vladimir Putin has been vicious in his repression of, at least in over the past 2 months, of any critics of the war. In fact, there are 15,000 Russians in prison right now who have been arrested for criticizing the war. And that has an effect. It has a psychological effect. It will cause people to second guess whether they'll criticize or walk out on the street and protest. But we need to get over that. We need to get over that. They need to get over that before we see any sort of change.
And he's running the disinformation war pretty effectively at home. Although, as I think we discussed the last time we talked, he hasn't shut down Ukraine to the degree that we thought he could. Maybe he can't.
No, he's hermetically sealed off his own people from the outside world. Our social media platforms, our media are not available to the Russian people. So he completely controls that information environment. And of course, in the context of Ukraine, in the Western world, he's trying to do the same. But he's not being very effective. The fact that he's called, everyone under the sun who criticizes his war a Nazi isn't helping him. I think that people in the Western world recognize that he's irrational and that he's engaging in these sort of tactics. And the only place that his information warfare is having an effect, and this should be a concern for Western governments, is in places like Africa and in Asia, who are supporting this. He's managed to position his war as a war between the East and the West, and he's positioned it that Western support of Ukraine is essentially a colonial land grab, which is of course nonsense. But he has been able to do that. And this is one area where, the West should also be paying attention, is fighting that information warfare and for democracy in the developing world.
I just want to end with one final word, because we spend an awful lot of time talking about Mr. Putin and his failures and his brutality. Ukraine, who can claim victory on many scores on a daily basis just because they're still standing, their country is decimated. He has taken out entire cities. He has left hundreds of thousands homeless, and there's nothing to go home to ever. Rebuilding those cities, I don't see even a variation on a Marshall Plan that would be able to rebuild it. Are you more optimistic than me?
Well, look, there as of this week, if I'm not mistaken, there are 8 million displaced people inside Ukraine right now. 8 million people.
Yeah,
that is an unfathomably large number of people who have been forced out of their homes. I'm glad that you bring up this question of rebuilding and such. I mean, this is something that the Western world needs to look at. How do we, we are moving towards that. Ukraine is successfully defending itself, and it is defending itself against this barbaric invasion. Who's going to pay for that? Who's going to pay for the rebuilding of it? Or is it the Canadian taxpayers? Is it going to be the U.S. taxpayers? Surely we are going to help with that, because it's in our interests, in our own security interests, to see Ukraine rebuilt and a stable Europe. But I would say one of the other things that we should be doing is looking at this bill, which I'm sure you're familiar with, that's moving through the Senate right now, the Frozen Assets Repurposing Act.
Yeah. Sell Putin's yacht and use the money.
Well, Senator, I would tell you that there are several oligarchs in this country who are on Canada's sanctions list, and the total value of their assets in this country exceeds, I would argue, probably $5 billion. Those assets could be sold off, and that would make a serious dent in the rebuilding of Ukraine. $5 billion in the context of this war perhaps isn't all that much, but it is a significant contribution. So this is something that I think that Canadians should be getting behind. Every senator should get behind, including the Foreign Interference Registry Act that was introduced by Senator Huzakos several months ago. But this Repurposing Act is a serious one, and I'm glad that the Canadian government and Minister Joly have signaled their support for it. So this is something, it's a tool that we should keep an eye on and make sure that we use to help rebuild Ukraine.
A great place to end, and thank you for that advice, and maybe even a little bit of admonition to get on with what we need to do here. I think I've got fire alarms going on in here, so I will say thank you so much. You're always very insightful and up to date on this topic, and we'll be back at you again, I'm sure, to see what progress we're making. Anytime. So thanks for being with us, Mr. Marcus Kolga. We'll talk soon.
Anytime. Thanks for having me on.
Great. That's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin.